Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, classmates. I am tasked with discussing one of the approaches to language testing, which is discrete point testing. But first, let us know what is meant by approaches to language testing. Now, different ways to test a student's ability to use and understand a language are called approaches to language testing. Common approaches include assessment of students' reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills. Now, each approach has its own advantages and disadvantages and can be used to evaluate different aspects of language proficiency. For today's objectives, we will focus on understanding the concept of discrete point testing and its importance. Number two, identify the characteristics of a discrete point testing approach. And lastly, number three, discover the benefits and drawbacks of using discrete point testing approach. Alright, so this time let us move on to the concept of discrete point testing, one of the approaches to language testing. Alright, so this time let us move on to the concept of discrete point testing. Now, discrete point testing is a language testing approach in which language proficiency is measured by assessing individual language elements or points in isolation. Now, this approach is most often used in assessment of language learners, and it is sometimes referred to as discrete point proficiency testing. Now, in the discrete point test, it assesses the language user's proficiency in a particular language by testing an individual's ability to really understand or produce a specific language elements such as grammatical structure, lexical elements, and pronunciation. Now, this approach is often used in the assessment of language learning performance or performances, as it allows for a more detailed analysis of language proficiency than other language testing approaches. In addition to what I made mention a while ago, now this discrete point tests are constructed on the assumption that language can be divided into its components or component parts, and those parts can be tested successfully. Now, the components are the skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and the various units of language are phonology, morphology, lexicon, and syntax. The goal of the discrete point test is to really get high reliability or reliability factor by testing a large number of separate items, but each question only tests one point of language. Alright, so this time let us move on to the characteristic of a discrete point testing approach. Now let's move on to the characteristic of a discrete point testing approach. Now, discrete point testing is a highly structured approach to language testing, which allows for clear and specific outcomes that can easily be interpreted. Now, the discrete point approach allows for a more objective evaluation of language proficiency than other approaches. Testing using the discrete approach is relatively easy to administer, as it is based on predetermined criteria and does not require a great deal of training or preparation. Now, the results of discrete point test or testing approach are often quantifiable. It's allowing for a more accurate comparison of language proficiency. Alright, so this time let us move on to the advantages and disadvantages of a discrete point testing approach. Alright, so let's move on to the first advantage of a discrete point testing approach. Now, this approach test can cover a wide range of materials to be tested. Now, it can test understanding of grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and pronunciation, as I made mention a while ago. It can also test one's ability to comprehend written and spoken language, as well as their ability to produce language through writing and speaking. Additionally, it can test one's knowledge of culture, customs, and colloquialisms. And the test can also provide a measure of one's fluency in the language by testing their ability to respond quickly to questions and comprehend instructions. Alright, so this time let us move on to the second advantage of discrete point testing approach. Now, the test allows quantification of the students' responses. Now, what is meant by quantification of students' responses? Now, this type of test is often used to really assess the ability to use a particular language, such as English language. It is meant to test how a student understands and uses different grammar concepts and words. Also, these tests usually involve multiple choice questions with discrete points for each answer. Now, the test can also be tailored to assess students' proficiency in specific areas such as writing, reading, speaking, and listening. Now, this type of test is often used to really assess students' language proficiency for admission to a university or higher education institutions. Alright, so this time let us move on to the very last advantage of a discrete point testing approach. Now, in terms of the scoring process, the test is also reliable because of its objectivity. The scoring is efficient even though it can be performed by a machine. Now, the discrete point testing approach eliminates the subjectivity of a language test as all questions are based on predetermined criteria. Now, this approach also eliminates the need of a third party to grade the test as it is based on a predetermined answer key. Now, this approach is also time efficient as it can be completed in a relatively short period of time. Additionally, this approach is cost efficient or cost effective as it does not require a large number of resources to really administer the test. And finally, this approach is more really reliable than others as its scoring is based solely on a predetermined criteria, making it easier to compare results across different tests. Alright, now that we are done with the advantages, let us move on to the disadvantages of a discrete point testing approach. Now, constructing discrete point test items is potentially energy and time consuming. The discrete point testing approach is a testing approach that involves test takers a set of items or questions that are designed to measure a specific concept or skill. The items are typically multiple choice, true or false, or short answer questions. Now, the discrete point testing approach is an effective way to really measure the person's knowledge or understanding of a particular subject. However, it is time consuming and labor intensive to design the approach or to administer the approach and grade the test utilizing this approach. Additionally, the approach really requires a great deal of energy and resources to ensure that the items are reliable, valid, and appropriate to the desired purpose. Let us move on to the second disadvantage of discrete point testing approach. Now, the second disadvantage is that the test does not include social context where verbal communication normally takes place. Now, this means that the test is designed to measure the language learning ability of the test takers in terms of their understanding of the use of words, grammar, and sentence structure. It does not measure the ability to test of the test takers to communicate in a social context such as conversations or debates. Alright, so this time let us move on to the very last disadvantage of a discrete point testing approach. Now, success in doing the test is not readily inferable from the ability to test takers or of the test taker to communicate in real life circumstances. Now, what is meant by this? Now, language tests that use discrete point testing are meant to measure the test taker's knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. They may not necessarily reflect the test taker's ability to communicate in real life scenarios, in real life situations. Now, success in these tests depends on the test taker's knowledge of the language, their ability to comprehend the test, their ability to follow instructions provided. Other factors such as the test taker's background experience and cultural context may also affect the results. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've learned a lot from our discussion today. Thank you and have a great day.